In Texas after Governor Greg Abbott called for the pardon of U.S. Army Sergeant Daniel Perry, who shot and killed Air Force veteran Garrett Foster during this July 2020 Black Lives Matter protest in Austin. Nearly 3 years after his death, justice came Friday for Garrett's fiancée and the Foster family.
The jury found the defendant Daniel Perry guilty of the offense of murder.
His fiancée writing on Instagram, "I love you and miss you so much."
When Army Sergeant Daniel Perry gunned down Black Lives Matter protester Garrett Foster in 2020, it was plainly murder. At least, that's what a Texas jury said when they unanimously convicted Perry for the crime. In most cases, this would be a surprising story of justice done right. But that isn't the case. That's because Texas Governor Greg Abbott has pledged to pardon Perry for what he calls a political persecution and what juries call a trial. Abbott says he interprets Texas's stand your ground law to be absolute, saying no jury has a right to question it. That's insane.
Perry hasn't been sentenced yet, but Governor Abbott directed the state's parole board to expedite review of Perry's conviction. Posting to Twitter, "I look forward to approving the board's pardon recommendation as soon as it hits my desk."
Texas Republicans are now circling their wagons to defend Perry. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, who is himself under multiple state investigations, signaled that it is now official Texas state policy to protect people who murder lefty protesters.
Real quick, will the parole board overturn this conviction of Sergeant Perry?
Look, I'm really optimistic. They're not elected. They're appointed by the governor. They're 7 members, and I sincerely hope that they will take what's happened into account, especially what you talked about, the investigator, and let this guy go, pardon him, because he does not deserve to go to prison.
Yeah, you heard that right. Ken Paxton said out loud that he's pretty confident the parole board will do whatever Governor Abbott wants, because that same parole board is filled with Abbott's political appointments. You want to talk about political persecution? The Texas Parole Board is basically a Soviet Politburo, with Governor Greg Abbott sitting at the top. But does Governor Abbott have a point? Of course not. Come on, he's an idiot. You know this. Abbott's loony idea that Texas's stand your ground law is absolute just doesn't hold up. In fact, the law contains a lot of limitations on when it can be invoked. And there's also a huge manual that I read, so you didn't have to. Probably most relevant here is the requirement that you can't provoke people, shoot them dead, and then claim to be standing your ground. And you can't invoke it at all if the person you're shooting isn't actually committing a crime. So how did Perry find himself shooting Garrett Foster? Here's how.
Perry's defense arguing the shooting was justified under the state's stand your ground law. But witnesses say Perry was the instigator.
The driver of this vehicle intentionally and aggressively accelerated into a crowd of people.
Sorry, buddy, you just can't claim to stand your ground when you're the person committing the crime. But that doesn't matter to Greg Abbott, who's taking the law into his own hands. And Abbott is sending a clear message to people like Daniel Perry. Murder is just fine as long as you're killing liberals. And the scary thing is, Greg Abbott isn't even the first Republican to do this. A central belief of the MAGA universe is that right-wingers should be free from justice as long as they're killing the right people, and they don't particularly care how you feel about it. Former President Donald Trump made that perfectly clear when he pardoned convicted war criminal Eddie Gallagher in 2019. Here's what some of Gallagher's own platoon mates had to say about him to the judge.
I think he's just wants to kill anybody he can. You can tell he was perfectly okay with killing anybody.
The men seen in civilian clothing were interviewed for an investigation into Eddie Gallagher's alleged war crimes in 2017, including the murder of a wounded ISIS fighter in Iraq. Some of the Navy SEALs nervously recounting Gallagher spiraling out of control, one even calling him evil.
The guy was toxic. The guy got crazier and crazier.
Gallagher was convicted of stabbing an Iraqi teen to death with a hunting knife, and testimony from his platoon mates convicted him. At the same time, his barbaric attacks on Iraqi children made him something of a MAGA folk hero. Gallagher's own brothers in arms warned that he was toxic and a danger to the military, but Donald Trump hailed him as a hero who was being unfairly punished for killing a bunch of foreigners. As you can see, Greg Abbott learned from the worst. Oh yeah, and don't forget, Trump also pardoned convicted federal felon and potential traitor Steve Bannon, because in Trump's world, if you're breaking the law to hurt Democrats, you aren't really breaking the law at all. Republicans aren't kidding around about putting their own supporters above the law. Donald Trump has already said that his first act as president, if reelected, would be to release every single January 6th insurrectionist currently sitting in prison. And not only that, Trump has promised them an official government pardon. What's happening